The old neighborhood. If you're driving to Parkland from downtown, your best bet is to take the Dan Ryan Expressway, I-57, which cleaves like a wide river with a bend here and a... My name is Eric Charles May, the author of Bedrock Faith, the 2021 One Book, One Chicago selection by the Chicago Public Library.
Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jennifer Lezak, Coordinator of Special Projects with the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Thank you for joining us for The Value of Community with DePaul University. This event is part of the 2021 One Book, One Chicago season, exploring the theme Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, and the book Bedrock Faith by Eric Charles May. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for other upcoming programs, reading recommendations, on-demand video content, and much more coming now through the end of the year. Tonight's program is possible, and One Book, One Chicago is generously funded by donations to the Chicago Public Library Foundation. Visit cplfoundation.org for information on how you can get involved with their work. During tonight's program, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions from the audience for our Q&A following the conversation, so please feel free to ask one at any time. Now for tonight's event. First, I want to thank our wonderful partners at DePaul University, especially John Shanahan, David Welch, and Lexi Wachtel for their partnership on One Book, One Chicago, especially during the last year with all of its challenges. We at the library are so happy to continue to work with you to present wonderful programs like tonight's event. So thank you to everyone in the DePaul community. Now for our panelists. Dr. Rita Mukherjee is the Ida B. Wells Barnett Fellow in the African and Black Diaspora Studies Department at DePaul University. Her research areas include contemporary Caribbean literature, gender theory, intersectional feminisms, and food studies. In 2020, she was a Fulbright Fellow in Kingston, Jamaica. She is the co-founder of Honey Literary, a BIPOC and queer-centric journal of art and writing, and also serves as the assistant poetry editor at Split Lip magazine. Dr. Megan Alderden is the associate professor and director of criminology at DePaul University. She has had over 20 years of experience conducting criminal justice related research, as well as implementation and outcome evaluations of criminal justice programs. Her work includes examining issues within the field of victimology and policing. She worked on 2 National Institute of Justice funded research studies examining the impact of forensic evidence on police and prosecutorial decisions in sexual assault cases, and was researcher with the National Police Research Platform, where her work focused on police diversification, police culture, and the civilianization of police agencies. She is currently an evaluator of a federally funded reentry program in Chicago and Cook County that focuses on job training and reentry support for individuals post-incarceration. Dan Stolar is the author of a collection of short stories, The Middle of the Night. His fiction and creative nonfiction have appeared in numerous publications, including the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Missouri Review, Bomb, the Omni Reader, and Chicago Tribune. He is an associate professor at DePaul University. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the Chicago Public Library for having us. I wanted to jump right in and start talking a little bit about Bedrock Faith. And before we are introduced to a single human character, the book begins with a very conscious 2-page description of this community, Parkland, at the far south end edge of Chicago. For all the real landmarks that the author Eric Charles May describes that lead us to the community and circumscribe it, it turns out it's a fictional place, at least in name. There is no actual Parkland, though it sounds like it was based in large part on Morgan Park, where the author grew up. I'd like to begin by just asking both Megan and Rita for a sort of holistic reaction to the novel and what it suggests about community. Rita, do you want to go first?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me this evening. The work of community building in Bedrock Faith is at times counterintuitive. People bond over things that people should not bond over. People experience camaraderie with one another in contexts that normally we wouldn't think of as inspiring camaraderie. And so as we see these kind of paradoxical reactions unfold, we see how much impact a community, no matter its size or makeup, we see the impact that it can have and the resonance that it can have, whether or not you stay inside that community.
Great. Thank you. Megan?
There were a couple of things that I noticed about the book that I kind of really resonated me. I'm going to start first with the ones that kind of consider like my criminology background. And then I'm going to talk personally because there is some levels I kind of connected personally to the novel. The first one is kind of, I see, from a criminology perspective, kind of this idea of community coming together. And as Rita kind of mentioned, this idea about what does that actually look like and the complexity of coming together and its impact on the individuals that live in those communities. But I also see a lot of vulnerability that we sometimes don't always share with one another throughout the book. Some of it is public information or becomes information that others don't realize is information their neighbors might know about them that they didn't know about themselves or didn't share with others. And so, and sometimes the vulnerability that people kept and held tight to their own person. And so I thought that was really interesting. And on a personal level, I grew up in a small town, so I didn't grow up in Chicago, but I see a lot of connections here of this community that comes together, knows each other, but the challenges that sometimes creates, like, so when you have a community where everyone knows your business and the challenges of trying to move beyond labels that might exist as a consequence of that knowledge. So I really enjoyed the book, so I'm excited to kind of dig into it a little bit deeper.
Thanks. Yeah, that paradoxical thing that Rita talked about, I thought was very interesting, and the role that gossip plays in this sort of Greek chorus we have of gossips who get things wrong and get things right and sort of extrapolate sometimes to, almost to the silly at times. But it did strike me, as a storyteller, the role that trying to come up with the stories we tell is a big part of community. And I thought I was very interested in that in this book. Thanks. Megan, you introduced me to the criminology terms collective efficacy and social capital. And I wondered if you could briefly explain those and maybe some of the current debate around them and how Bedrock Faith provides us a lens through which to view these things.
Sure. Collective efficacy is a term in the research, in the sociological, criminological research that refers to kind of the social cohesion amongst neighbors and their willingness to intervene on the behalf of the common good. So this idea that this network of groups of families and churches and schools and other kind of important institutions and groups are coming together kind of to support kind of this idea of a shared vision for the community. And so intervening for the common good, crime prevention is often discussed in relation to this. And what we find in the literature is that communities have this like powerful ability to produce informal social control mechanisms that really do are way more powerful than any kind of formal organization. So policing, courts, all of these kinds of things that we often think about when we think about producers of public safety. Well, communities are actually the #1 producers of safety. We just don't always recognize this. And so when reading when reading the book, you definitely see these elements of it, right? So the community group coming together to kind of talk about when Stu Pot returns to community, and wanting to make sure that there's a norm setting around what behavior is considered acceptable within the community, and the desire for the group to have somewhat control over that, and to kind of be able to step in. I think the challenge is there's been some critique around the collective efficacy idea. Like some people call it like the secret sauce of communities. But, you know, the question is like maybe having too much secret sauce isn't always a great thing. And some of the challenges of like what happens when that same kind of willingness to come together is actually what's also undermining the community's ability to be open to other members within the community who may be trying to kind of move forward with their lives, or are maybe different than others in the community. What happens when the community aligns around norms that maybe are exclusionary in nature? So the best example in criminology so far in this discussion is, you know, around domestic violence, and how collective efficacy could actually reinforce secrecy amongst families by creating a norm of domestic violence is private. And so I think this is kind of, and again, I think this book kind of highlights just some of the potential negative consequences of when communities come together and they decide, you know, Stu Pot, we need to keep an eye on him, we need to surveil him, we need to, you know, question everything that he's doing. It becomes a lot of the center of everyone's attention, even though I'm not entirely sure some of the behavior that he's doing is that questionable and worthy of the surveillance that they're doing. So,
and it almost takes on a bit of a vigilante component at times, right? And when does, you know, I guess when does collective efficacy become a sort of vigilantism?
Right, and there's some, you know, critique around like gentrified neighborhoods where new people move in and all of a sudden they decide that the behaviors that may have been completely normal in that community are no longer accepted to the for the people who are moving in. And you know, this idea of like, well, who gets to decide what's acceptable behaviors and what's not, and so I think this book does a good job of kind of tapping into some of those complex community level neighborhood issues.
Yeah, are there ways that you can consciously try to harness those things, or do they just have to sort of evolve naturally? I mean, are there ways to consciously build them? I guess create different clubs and organizations, or?
Yeah, I think there's ways for the communities to kind of naturally develop these resources. I think there's also ways for government to kind of support the enhancement of this, right? So encouraging programming that's built around bringing people together, and positive youth development type programs that really are about civic engagement and getting youth to feel empowered to change the world around them, are all ways in which you can build kind of this common value in community. But I think, again, like at the end of the day, there's also needs to be a recognition that this can also turn into, you know, a challenge. You know, one of the notes that I have in my book right when I first started was, it's interesting that a lot of the surveillance that the community is doing is really reminiscent of policing surveillance. And so they almost take on like that formal institution behavior. And you see some of the consequences of that for Stu Pot, but I would say also for the community members who decide to take it in their own hands to try to address some of these issues.
So one aspect of the community that does feel sort of problematic, especially to our 2021 eyes, is its reaction to homosexuality. Rita, I wondered if you'd be willing to address that, and maybe more generally representations of queerness in African American literature.
Absolutely. This novel doesn't endeavor to speak in a queer register. This novel is not interested necessarily in probing those issues. And that comes off in the prose. The language that's used around women characters and their queerness and the eroticism of queer love is very, very removed, very sanitized. There's almost no consideration of the physical body. There's almost no language specific to queer sex practices or queer intimacies writ large. And as such, you feel the judgment that the community displays around queerness, and you feel the synthesis of gentrification and homophobia. It's not a question of orientation, or it's not a debate about the politics of human relationships. It's a debate about propriety. And there are characters in the novel who are deeply disturbed that they are in the presence of a queer woman. Right. And that's something that they actively choose to opt for a kind of moral outrage. Everyone is cognizant that there are queer people. There are queer people living in the neighborhood, and they have lived there for many years and seem relatively open about their relationship. And still in the community, there are constantly these euphemisms, right? Like so-and-so's friend. We don't hear that a ton anymore, which is great. But simultaneously, we see just how tough it is for our queer Black community members to find spaces where they are going to be treated with respect. We find it, we endeavor constantly to talk about allyship and community building. Well, when allyship is already null and void, how are people supposed to coexist in a space? And I think the queerness in the novel that we see helps us identify just how erratic Stu Pott grows in his actions. We're not talking about blatant displays of love and affection wherein people are really called to look at and reckon with these queer women. We're talking about someone stalking a lesbian. We're talking about someone threatening her and basically saying she's a lost soul because of her orientation. More broadly, in Black lit, we are seeing more queer representation, especially in poetics. I still think that fiction has a lot of work to do in its representation of these dynamics. And I think the alienation in that sense of kind of the sanitized language works here, because we're literally watching this woman get more and more alienated from her community until she ceases to be a part of that community at all. So I think this works in that fashion, but moving forward, more of us as queer people of color are saying, don't tell our stories, right? This author is not a queer Black woman. That's not a narrative he knows.
Right. I was interested, you brought up gentrification both in part of your answer to this question and in some of our back and forth, and I thought that sort of gentrification was in a way notably absent from this novel. So it's interesting to me that you saw it. I guess I didn't see that as a central issue to this novel, and I'm curious to hear you respond to that.
Yeah, the really Baroque descriptions in this novel are where I identified the majority of the gentrification. May pays a really strange amount of attention to interiority, and that's not a technique that we champion in fiction today. In fact, I think that you'd be hard pressed to find a fiction workshop that encourages you to give us all the set dressing. What color are the drapes? What is the area rug like? What is on the credenza? This constant cataloging of interiority and commodities, right? What kind of wood floor is it? What kind of binding does the Bible have? That is extremely reminiscent of a gentrified space.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah, I guess I was thinking in much more literal terms about who's moving into the neighborhood, but yeah, I think that's a much more interesting way to think about it, actually. All right. I was struck by the line in the book, "Who do you know ever got better from being in jail?" very early. spoken by this sort of gossip chorus that I've mentioned. And this line cuts a number of ways and is a powerful commentary in itself. Megan, I wondered if you could address the issues Stu Pott faces coming back to the same community he was a part of when he went to jail, and the unavoidable ways he's clearly been labeled by that community.
Sure. So obviously, I mean, I think it's very clear, and I think, you know, early on, it becomes obvious that Stu Pott did some of the things, or at least all of the things that the community had thought he had done before he had gone, and maybe even more than what we kind of hear about. And coming back, he admits to a lot of it too. And I think the intentionality behind that was to kind of ask for forgiveness, right? And try to address that through some kind of, you know, at least acknowledging that harm. I think it's really the people who get sentenced to jail or a portion of prison time, they face significant challenges. Just to be clear, so jail is usually temporary. Most people are convicted for longer sentences. They go to prison, which is even longer or more challenging issues that they face. But just to name a few, first of all, the practices in prison make it difficult, and especially for someone who has mental illness, make it really challenging for those individuals to have the care that they need so that they can have an easier transition back into community. Some of those kind of behaviors that happen within the prison system include, you know, the use of segregation and isolation tactics to prevent or reduce maybe conflict that might be having, or addressing other issues that might be having in the prison. But the consequence is that it actually exacerbates mental illness. And so even individuals who enter prison without any mental illness can actually leave prison with some. So just at that level. And then, you know, prison breaks a lot of the bonds that we know are the things that help us connect to the communities where we live. It breaks your family bonds because you no longer have contact with your families, or at least as much as you used to. In some cases, you might not have physical contact with your family, meaning that you won't see them physically, you won't be able to touch them physically, the kinds of things that we know make us human beings, right? When you have breaks in employment, or even if you were underemployed, many individuals prior to going to prison actually have some kind of economic contribute economically to their families. And so that breaks that issue. It breaks if you're attending education, your peer groups, all kinds of things, your connections to other community groups. So all of these things become broken. And then depending on how long you're there, it can actually become even more challenging to address them as you come back out. So prison is a breaking tool. It's an isolating tool. It's a tool of social control that actually can actually harm both the individual, the families, and the communities. Then as individuals are coming back and they're trying to create some of these connections, you know, they're coming back to communities where they already were struggling. So they may are already living in poverty or other kind of challenges that they may have been experiencing at home. It's complex. It's a challenge for the families, because while it might be a celebration to have your loved one return, it also comes with the complexity of adding another person to the household. There may have been harm that person had done to others in the household. And so you create these kind of complex challenging relationship issues as you're returning home. It's extremely stressful for people returning home, high rates of suicide, as well as other kinds of depression as they kind of integrate back into a life that, depending on how long it's been, doesn't look the same anymore. So if you've been gone for 20, 30 years, the world has changed dramatically, and you've kind of been excluded from that transformation that's happened. So all of these things are challenges that people face: homelessness, housing challenges, substance use issues, mental health issues, family issues. And then on top of all that, prison doesn't do a lot to try to address any of these things. And in many cases, they don't address any of the drivers that we know are criminogenic. So there's certainly not spaces that make people better. And so it's not surprising that Stu Pott, even in his best intentions of trying to use what limited tools he was given, struggled to try to do that. And then on top of all of those things, all of these people were labeling him and were not willing to consider that he may have changed. Already they labeled him as being the same person the minute he stepped into the community. So,
with the possible exception of Mrs. Mata, right? She seems perhaps.
Yes, she's a little bit more forgiving. I guess that is true.
One of the questions that I thought about as I read this book was a question of genre. To what extent is this a work of realism or suspense, or should it be considered more absurdist at times? When is it engaging in social commentary and even social satire? Rita, I wondered if you'd be willing to address this question of social satire and Black conventions of social commentary in literature more generally.
Absolutely. So as we see in works by Richard Wright, Langston Hughes, as we see those narratives of crime and of victimization and just general subjugation of the Black male character, one thing that we can definitely see in this novel as well is just a keen attention to counter narrative as well as narrative. So we'll experience something from the point of view of Mrs. Motley, right? And we'll be with her one moment, looking out the window, right? Peering out through the curtains. And then perhaps in the next passage, we'll be with Stewpot and we'll be on the other side and we'll be kind of jumping over the wall with him. So I think May's attention to vantage point here really helps us see the social commentary that's happening. I agree that there's some absurdism in the conflict and in the diametric opposition that Stewpot receives when he gets home. Like Megan was saying, it's just completely unanimous. Like they have that neighborhood meeting and they all conclude that he's full of it. He's not to be trusted. And, he never had a chance, right? Nobody was open to the idea of his reform. And so it's hard for us then to escape, right? The idea of maybe self-fulfilling prophecy and that overdetermined space. I wonder if also the comment that May is making is that we, as the reader, we do get to decide. I think the narration is third person for the entire novel. Correct me if that's not true. I think so. And so we really do get to decide with as much information at hand as I think we could possibly get. We really do get to choose a camp. And there were times where initially when I was reading, I was irritated that the community was showing him hostility, and then hearing more about some of the assorted sins he committed, I was like, yeah, no, that man would not be allowed in 3 feet of my lobby. Like I wouldn't want anything to do with him either. But that begs the question then, what possible solution could there be? Can we ever help a Stewpot change? And I think that's really the large question that May wants us to reckon with. And I don't have an answer to that large question, but I think what he's doing here in terms of commentary, and especially with attention to Chicago and the really drastic changes the city has seen, I think he's calling us to action in a lot of ways and asking us to do better.
And he explicitly mentions Native Son at one point. He has a title of a chapter called "The Fire Next Time." I mean, he's clearly conscious of being a part of a certain tradition and speaking to that tradition. Megan, you were going to add something there?
Well, I was just, whenever I agree, like you go through the book and you're like, oh, don't do that, Stewpot. Like, oh, and then the community, like, I can't believe the community is behaving. And then I started thinking, it's like, part of what kind of made me think a lot about Stewpot and his chances is this idea that there is good in everyone. And you saw some of that come out in him. It was just difficult for the community, I think, sometimes to recognize it. Instead, they looked at it from the lens of what they already knew about him or what they perceived they thought they knew about him. And so I really I think as the reader, you do kind of struggle with like, who is right? Like I actually have that written is like, who is right here? Who's blame? And maybe that isn't the right question, but it does it was just something that always kind of was in the back of my mind as I read this.
But and to me, it's a really interesting tension throughout a lot of this book, because Stu Pott does these things that are sort of horrific, but a lot of times it's almost programmed to exploit the foibles of the neighborhood, right? You know, so he exposes Irma's homosexuality, but it's the neighborhood that has the disastrous response, right?
Yeah.
He exposes the Davenport daughter's diary, but again, that reflects the Davenports and their relationship to the neighborhood. So it is I think a really interesting tension that really propels, I think, 2/3 or 3/4 of this book, who is right kind of thing.
Right. And like they run over his dog, like,
and they run over, right?
Like it was like, oh, well, there goes his dog, right?
It's
like,
funny, my students always sympathize so much with the dog. That's
Yeah.
the thing, and people sympathize with the dog.
Yeah. They try to burn down his house. Like there's all of these things, and yet we see, I think it's like you also kind of have, sympathy for the kid who's doing it because he thinks it's the right thing to do because he's seen the adults around him
right
doing these things. So yeah.
Right. So clearly one of the issues that comes up and reappears in this book a lot is the issue of religion in the church. Whether it's the community it creates or the more personal spiritual journey that we see glimpses of through Mr. McTeer and Mrs. Motley. And we see briefly the conflict between the two mainstream churches in the neighborhood. We see Mr. McTeer's Catholicism as both a personal comfort and a roadblock to his relationship with Mrs. Motley. And we see the comfort Mrs. Motley gets from her faith. And then, of course, there's the fire and brimstone of Stu Pott, the sort of super exaggerated version that he represents. I wonder, both of you, if you could address the representation of religion in the church and Bedrock Faith and how and the tradition this fits into and its role in community. Rita, do you want to start with that?
Absolutely. So with the Black church, especially just as a construct, there's been a serious hesitancy with critique around and about the Black church. It almost has at times seemed like the Black church is above reproach. And so to find ourselves in this novel wherein there are all of these people who are behaving really sanctimoniously and in turn becoming just as villainous as the person that they're condemning, we see that hypocrisy so clearly. And I think often in Black communities, faith and participation in faith is synonymous with respectability. Like, of course, you would go to church because you're a good person. It's inconceivable to think of someone who could be a part of the community and be respectful, but doesn't practice Christianity. So I think May wants us to be a little skeptical, and he wants us to be agitated by Stu Pott's really zealotous rhetoric. I mean, he is like out on a train platform preaching a sermon. Like it's absurd. Right. And we would certainly gawk, right? If we saw something like that, it would catch our attention. And so there's really no normal way to be a person of faith in this book because everybody is kind of doing a little bit too much. They're either being hypocritical or, as Stu Pott is just kind of appointing himself the moral custodian of the neighborhood. I think while church and houses of faith have great potential to foster communities and really be the backbone, I think in this case, the bedrock, it's not faith. Faith doesn't repair the community. Christianity doesn't help people make good choices. They say one thing, they do something very different.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Rita said. When you look through the book, you can see how individuals even using their faith as the excuse that they can rely on to excuse the behaviors that they're, and even like faith being kind of like a thing for worry that you might be judged by the others in your community. To judge someone for handing Sue a Bible seems really interesting to me, because you know, if anything, that seemed like that was like a gift that she was trying to provide him, and it became this kind of fear of like, I'm going to be judged for it. And so I think it's an interesting thing. I think it's interesting that Stupat takes it to such an extreme, but I think in doing so, he kind of points out, you know, the frailty of human beings. None of us can ever be the things that he was suggesting. And the community was up in arms over it. And yet they were doing the same thing to him, that he was never going to be this perfect person. So I just thought that was, you know, it's interesting how it kind of played out and was such a thread through the book.
Rita, I wanted to follow up just a little bit on a word you used and an idea that you'd also introduced, this idea of respectability politics or respectability. I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that and its role in this community, in this novel.
Sure. So I think as we get to know more characters, especially when we're at that big community block meeting, sort of what to do about Stupat, we see that there are small hierarchies within the community. There are some people who are thought of as more well-to-do, and then there's, you know, some curiosity about maybe women who are single or widowed and living on their own. There's constantly sort of a moral lens being cast, and I don't know that necessarily there's anyone in the community who opposes having, you know, faith be this kind of backbone, being this through line with their community. I feel like everyone is very comfortable with that being a sort of benchmark for the space and for people that they want to call neighbors. Historically, I think a lot of people of color are maybe not pushed, but encouraged to attend church and participate in church things, because it's often one of the only spaces that consistently addresses and is interested in communities of color. And so when we see, especially like young Black people seeking out church, seeking out as either a place to, you know, community build, network, or just even out of habit, sometimes that participation in faith can be a term where, or excuse me, not a term, but that practice can be seen as an endeavor to look a certain way, to be received a certain way and thought of as, you know, maybe a good person or someone who's well-to-do. And there isn't really like explicit interrogation of faith in this text, but there's homogeny. And I think that speaks for itself, that even when Stupat is, you know, having this conversation with Mrs. Motley about church, and, you know, she does this very, I think, Christian thing and invites him to come and listen to the pastor, and he's livid, he's furious, right? And so in that moment, he's definitely marked as an other, right? He doesn't want to go participate in church like everyone else, and so he must then inherently be the bad guy, since he's refusing that politics of respectability.
Right.
Yeah, the minute I saw that question and that communication, othering like totally popped in my head. Like, it's very easy to see how Stupat could be placed in that position across a number of things. Just how they talk about his mom, just how they talk about his life, that everything about him is everything that they don't want to be associated with, because it kind of taints them as a community. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I guess the last thing that I sort of wanted to ask about was the issue of mental health in the novel. And it feels to me that this novel almost doesn't even take it on as a consideration until about 3/4 or 4/5 the way through, and then it becomes the thing that the book hinges upon.
Yeah.
And I wondered if that in itself was a sort of commentary. And then, what is the relationship of community to the mental health needs of its members? And should we have been tipped off earlier by Stu Pott's behavior? And how can the community respond when mental health issues cross over into violence? And maybe we'll start with Megan, and then Rita, if you want to address that too, that'd be great.
Sure. I think I'll speak for myself. It was completely shocking to learn about a pretty extreme mental health issue that Stu Pott has. And just to be clear, that's usually not even the conditions a lot of people experience who've been involved in the system are usually not that severe. There are a portion, but one concern, of course, is this connection between mental illness and violence, because I think that's a misnomer of sorts. And so this connection of these two things together, I think makes it a little concerning from a realist perspective, what's really happens in communities. But in terms of kind of, my own reflection of reading the book, I was pretty shocked. And then I started thinking to myself, should have there been at any point a realization that maybe Stu needed support? And I won't even say mental health assistance, but maybe just support. And I think we can look back and see several places where he certainly was struggling, and he really, really was challenged to address these issues. And I think there were attempts by certain groups like his mom, the pastor that he tries to connect with, and other people who really did try to assist him. It's just that they may not have been the right resource for him. The book doesn't really speak to whether the community has those resources, but we do know so many communities don't. So,
right. And to Megan's point, communities of color are notorious for placing very little value and very little attention on mental health and mental health awareness. And so we can interpret that as, again, a call to action to improve our literacy with mental health issues in mind. When we talk about mental health, we tend to be talking treatment. We tend to be talking about what to do after an incident. We don't pay a lot of attention to preventative action. We don't do a lot of work with de-escalation. And bystander training, I think, is starting to become a little more common, especially like at the university level. But that doesn't mean that communities are practicing the same things we see in institutions. So I agree, it was a strange use of mental health issues, and it was a strange treatment of it. And I think what we should kind of take from that is increased concern and increased attention to our communities of color. Medically speaking, Black men have been depicted historically as stronger and more capable and more resilient. And so in DSM-5 and other similar documents, race isn't really taken into consideration to the extent that it needs to, because it absolutely shapes the way that you can get help, and if you can get help, what happens next.
Thank you. Jennifer, were you gonna give us some comments from questions from the crowd?
We have a couple of questions from the audience that have
Great.
come in, so we'll get to a few of these. The first one kind of goes off of a little bit about what Rita was just saying, but how do you think that the neighbors in the book should have treated Stu Pott, both before he went to prison and after when he was returning? Would it have changed things if he had been treated differently? And what can we learn about that for our actual lives, not just our fictional book?
I guess I'll start. I think some of that, I think I struggle with this, I'll be honest with you, because, I could talk from a very criminal justice perspective and say, well, he should have had a risk assessment, needs assessment, so we can identify what, issues he might have and how to best treat them. And I'm not saying that that's not true. Those are things are true, but from a community perspective, I think that too much of what we do is absent of the community where you're returning to, absent of your family, absent of the kind of really support systems that individuals need. And so to me, I think what could have been helpful is, maybe some key advocates that exist within the community, that could have been in the community, that could have maybe assisted him in navigating some of these issues and helping educate the community around some of these facts, and maybe even having someone who's already experienced returning from incarceration themselves be part of that space, I think may have been helpful for Stupa. He clearly wanted assistance, I think.
Right, I think strategically planning again beforehand and not after the fact could have been helpful. I think that his mother desperately needed support. Early in the book, there's a remark about, I think Mrs. Motley goes and complains about the dog poop. And she says, "Oh, I just don't know what to do." That's troubling. Not being able to feel like you can speak to your child or control someone who lives in your home, that's really disturbing. And I think if we're talking about, red flags, people, harming animals, things like that, that's, I think, generally seen as indicative of some really, troubling socio-psychological issues. So the signs were there, right? And the community, I guess, was either not equipped or not interested in providing that support and structure. And today, I do think, this takes place in the 90s. And so I think now we see an increase of community outlets for young people, even young people who are not particularly troubled one way or the other, experiencing challenges one way or another, just to show them, this is the space we live in, and here's how we hold one another accountable.
That's great. Actually, the next question kind of goes along with what you just said, Rita, too, was this book was set in the early 90s. Do you think that the novel would be set, if it was set in 2021, would it be different with regard to queer characters, with regard to how formerly incarcerated people are treated coming out, etc.?
With attention, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, with attention to queerness, this novel can't take place in 2021. It's a non-issue. Even if you go to, the deepest of the deep South and you move through space as a queer person, there are queer Southern spaces. There are queer rural spaces, and you can go to prison for outing people. That is a crime, and that action in this text is criminal. So I don't think it's compatible with a contemporary setting.
From a reentry standpoint, I'd like to say that there's been some significant improvements, but I would probably say it's much more of a still needing a work in progress. It's like, we're a caution, put up the construction signs, because, I think we have spent way too much time in this country trying to figure out how to put people into prison, and we've spent very little time thinking about the consequences of it. And now we are trying to unravel that a bit. And unfortunately, in the middle of all of that discussion are real people whose lives have been massively changed forever because of those experiences. And so, unfortunately, I think that some of the experiences that Stupa has as he's coming back, whether that's not having the support systems that he needs to be able to move forward in a positive way, I think that's a real thing that continues to be a reality.
That's great. And I think we have time for one more question, which says, Megan, I liked the phrase you used, informal social control and community. Can you share more about that? How can we build that positively in our neighborhoods, block clubs, mutual aid, etc.?
Yeah, there's lots of different ways that communities can build that within their communities. I think some positive youth development programs are really great spaces for young people to come together and kind of create spaces where they feel empowered to, and they feel that they belong, and they can create like spaces of value where they collectively come around and agree on how to move forward in their lives. And I think these are great spaces. There's also spaces, you know, community networking, all of these things that build the social capital of the communities are all things that communities can do. Like I mentioned, I think government plays a role here, right? So funding these activities and funding them in a way that doesn't, so currently a lot of grant funds do kind of what I call innovative funding. So it's like they give you some funds to be innovative, and then 3 years later, they tell you you're on your own to try to figure out how to keep that innovation going. And that's really sad, because all that does is take that innovation away, because you're talking about communities that they wouldn't be going to for those grant funds in the first place if they didn't need them to do innovation. And so like really rethinking how we invest in communities so that we produce long-term sustainable things that produce the kinds of informal control, social capital, all of the kind of things that make communities safer, but also produce healthy health and well-being, to do those kinds of things in a way that actually is thoughtful for communities versus how we do them now. I think that would be my kind of suggestion moving forward. If I had money and I could make long-term decisions about it, that's definitely where I would put it.
And I think Megan saying that is crucial, because it is not the responsibility of marginalized communities to accrue social capital. It is the responsibility of people like us who are privileged to do that work and give service and provide resources and offer our time, whether that's formal or informal, you know, larger, more grant-based project like she was describing, or if that's just taking some time out of your week and volunteering, if that's just walking down, you know, in your commute and picking up trash, right? The way to navigate this as a social system has to be done as a collective, or else we really can't achieve any equity.
Right.
And Dan, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that,
Well,
or you had some closing.
No, I was curious to ask both of you how, if you do anything conscious in your classes or among your colleagues to try to create a sense of community, and if it works.
Yeah, so prior to being at DePaul, I taught women's and gender studies at Iowa State University. And as a out queer woman of color, it's essential to build community. And I signpost immediately, because when students are signing up to take a class like queer studies, there's a good chance that they have an interest in that area, or that they themselves are queer. So when they come into my classroom, I need them to understand you are represented by your instructor, you're represented in this curriculum, and you're not going to be talked at about a lived experience that you yourself embody. Now at DePaul, obviously I'm in African and Black diaspora studies, and I am an Asian person, I'm not a Black woman. And so it's important for me to pass the mic and build community and show my dedication to the Black community by teaching exclusively Black scholars, for instance, by teaching lesser read authors, newer authors, and people who embody different intersections. I want students to be able to go into a class and see that people like me are professors, even though maybe I don't look the way that they think a professor should look. And it's my sincere hope that that community building sculpts their experience as a whole and lets them know you can demand representation. You can ask that of communities that profess to care about you.
That's great. Thank you.
You know, in criminology, it's an interesting kind of group. So we often have students who are coming to our program to try to understand their life and the things that they've experienced, whether it's previously been a victim, or they lived in a community that's been impacted by crime, or their family members have been just as involved. And so we often have a very wide range of people, and some people who don't have any of those experiences, but are interested for whatever reason. And to be quite frank, sometimes it's because they see some things on TV and they think it looks interesting, right? And how to bridge all of those different experiences into a class can be challenging, but it can also be so rewarding when we're willing to kind of share our vulnerabilities. And I think, part of the classroom is trying to pull some of those out. And I agree, it's like offering diverse readings and offering kind of various perspectives and spaces for students to explore content, clearly using theory and all of the great, things that we do in academia, but also integrating their own experience to reflect on that, I think are ways that as professors, we can help show them, I think, really important tools that they're going to need to use anyways in the workplace. And part of that is just recognizing that I may not have a complete understanding of this issue, and someone else's understanding maybe an experience may be completely valid. And I need to recognize that. And how do I navigate a really difficult conversation that makes me uncomfortable in a way that is that moves the conversation forward? So I think those are great spaces for students to kind of explore. And when you do it right, you can feel it in the classroom. And when it doesn't sometimes go as well as you want, you step back and have to figure out a new strategy.
That's great. Well, I think that is all the time we have for tonight, but I want to thank Dr. Rita Mukherjee, Dr. Megan Alderden, and Dan Stoller for being here with us tonight. Special thanks also to Lexi Watchell and David Welch for their work in making tonight's event possible. Thanks to CPL Tech Leland Mosley for producing tonight's event, and thanks to all of you for being here. Please visit onebookonechicago.org for information on other upcoming events around our theme, Neighborhoods, Our City's Bedrock, including book discussions, films, author events, art programs, and more. Also, visit the CPL YouTube and Facebook pages for on-demand video content, including from tonight's program. Have a great week, everyone.